thank you all for coming. I can guarantee that everyone is going to learn something interesting tonight. Tonight's speaker, who I'll try to steal as little time as possible from, was invited by me on behalf of the Medieval Studies faculty, Medieval Studies, which perhaps I should explain a little. I am an English professor who specializes in medieval literature, but my degree, all of my degrees actually, are not in, I don't have any English degrees. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell the dean. They're all in medieval studies, which means studying this specific time period, drawing upon the expertise of a variety of disciplines: history, languages, literature, art history, philosophy, religious studies, and we could add to that. When I came to IPFW, I dreamed of setting up a program in medieval studies so that students could see the benefits and the fun of studying my favorite time period interdisciplinarily. I figured setting up a program like this would take years of begging the administration, people like the dean, until they finally relented and finally said, fine, you can do whatever you want to do. Instead, Dean Drummond, who just introduced us, brought the idea to me. He noticed, hey, we have a bunch of professors here who work in medieval studies. You guys like working together with each other, don't you? You should do that. And so we've created an interdisciplinary minor in medieval studies. We also created a course, which a number of you are enrolled in, which captures the interdisciplinary aspect of medieval studies by having it team taught by professors in history, language and literature, art history, and religious studies. We also wanted to capture one of the most exciting and often least well-known aspects of the Middle Ages, the encounters between medieval Europeans. Usually when we think about the Middle Ages, we think about Europeans, but think about them in the context of other world cultures. Many people know about knights and castles, catapults, things like that. But the Middle Ages was also a time of the origin of many relevant issues of world culture, things like trade between Europe and the East, anti-Semitism, the idea of the Holy Land, and Christian relations and understanding of Islam, which brings me to tonight's speaker. When the other medievalists and I decided to try to get the external distinguished lecturer to be someone of our choosing, Professor Thomas Burman was our first choice. Professor Burman exemplifies medieval studies. He started as an undergraduate studying Spanish and history at Whitman College in Washington, and then moved to the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, which is where I went to school, where he earned not only a master's and PhD in medieval studies, but also a licentiate from the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, which means Professor Burman is licensed by the Pope to discuss medieval topics, so you can trust anything he says. Professor Burman's work focuses on one of the most fascinating but perhaps neglected areas of medieval Europe, the multicultural world of medieval Spain, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived alongside of each other, often peacefully. I say neglected because studying medieval Spain is hard. Most medievalists, right after the degrees, like most medievalists, right after the degrees he has earned, Professor Burman on his resume lists the languages he knows so he can study this culture, including Spanish, French, Latin, and Arabic, and then, you know, German, Italian, Portuguese, Catalan. Standard fare for medievalists. What's really special here is Latin and Arabic. There are a lot of people who study Latin. There are a lot of people who study Arabic. There are not a lot of people who study both of them, which opens up a world of research which is hidden to many scholars because they don't have the skills to study them. Professor Burman's work has earned him many international accolades and appointments, including a position as a Rockefeller Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of Islamic Societies and Civilizations at Washington University in St. Louis. He was the Abdul Aziz At Mualla Visiting Fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. He is currently full professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and distinguished professor of the humanities. He has served as the head of Tennessee's Marco Institute for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and is currently the head of the Department of History. He has published dozens of articles in his field of specialty, edited 2 collections of essays, and authored 2 books, Religious Polemic and the Intellectual History of the Mozarabs, 1050 to 1200, and more recently, Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom, 1140 to 1560. Tonight, he will be speaking on medieval Christians and the Holy Book of Islam. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tom Burman.
Thanks very much. So can you hear me out there? Very good. This introduction makes it just a lot weirder that I dreamt that I was being elected Pope last night. Who knows where that's going to go? That can't be good at all. Thank you, Damien, for such a kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the other members of the Medieval Studies Committee and the Dean for inviting me here. It's very exciting to see what's happening here in medieval studies, and I know that feeling of excitement. I've really enjoyed helping build up the medieval studies program at my institution, and it's fun to make these things work. Let me ask a question of the camera person here. I tend to wander when I lecture. Is that going to cause problems for you? Okay, I just don't want to offend the people with the cameras. They have important things to do. I want to talk to you tonight about a subject that probably we all have an idea about, what it must have been like for medieval Christians to read the Quran. We probably all have an idea about that. And our idea is when they read the Quran, medieval Christians must have sort of had steam coming out of their ears, kind of foaming at the mouth. We have this sense that it can't have been something that they enjoyed doing. They must have responded to the Quran with enormous hostility. And it is true that a lot of the time they did read the Quran in just that way. But what I want to suggest tonight is that they were capable of reading it in very different other ways as well. That medieval people were, just like you and I, very capable of having very complicated reactions to things and perfectly capable of being of 2 or 3 minds about something and holding contradictory ideas in their head at the same time. And I want to do that by a series of case studies. 4 case studies of different interactions between medieval European Christians and the Quran. And before I get to those medieval Christians and the Quran, I want to first point out something that may surprise you, and that is that the Quran was actually kind of a bestseller in medieval Europe. It was such a bestseller that by the time we get to the 16th century, there was a Reader's Digest abbreviated version of it available. And that's what you see here before you, a text called the Al-Qurani Epitome, the sort of condensed version of the Quran, which was printed in 1542 and circulated in a certain number of printed copies, although it circulated in about 5 manuscripts in addition to that as well. There was a lot of interest in the Quran in the Middle Ages. If you want to know statistics, there are about, that survive to this day, there are some 35, maybe 38 manuscripts of the Quran in Latin translation. I'll talk about that process in a minute, that survive to this day in Western Europe and some are in North America. That is a lot of manuscripts to survive from a single work to the present. And so when I say it's a bestseller, in many ways it really was. In addition to that, we know that the Quran also circulated in Arabic manuscripts in Latin Europe. And I'm going to show you one of those in a minute. There are about 6 other manuscripts like that we know to have circulated. So a lot of people were reading the Quran. I've likened it before in print to sort of the situation that people my age were in back when the Cold War was at its height and we went off to college and everybody read the Communist Manifesto. You know, it seemed like you needed to know about this because this powerful outside civilization was in some sense built around it. And so the Quran attracted a lot of readers. And the first case study I want to talk about is this one. Now, I apologize. The images you're seeing have been stretched out a little bit more than they ought to be by the system. This is an image, and I'm not sure if you can see it all that well, this is an image of Muhammad. Oh, let's see, is my pointer working? Yeah. This up here is one of the Latin spellings of the name Muhammad, Muhammad. And this is a picture of him. And you can see in the manuscript, most of this is bright red, and it doesn't come through in a black and white photo. But here's Muhammad as a combination fish and man, a kind of a monstrous being. And this picture comes from the oldest manuscript of the Quran in Latin that survives from the middle of the 12th century. And it is a manuscript of a translation of the Quran by a man named Robert of Ketton, who was, of all things, an Englishman who had come down to Spain and for various reasons had learned Arabic and had been hired to do this. And this picture kind of sums up this way of reacting to the Quran that I talked about at the beginning, the foaming at the mouth, steaming at the ears version of reading the Quran. And if we look closely at this manuscript, we find a fair amount of evidence that at least the people who put this manuscript together assumed that is how Christians wanted to read the Quran. So, in this particular version of the Quran in Latin, in a very large number of the manuscripts that survive, there is effectively a marginal commentary, which you see over here. It was written at the same time as this text was translated, and it was sort of the marginal notes that were supposed to help you understand the Quran. And as a friend of mine, another scholar, put it once, they're there to tell you where to be outraged when you read the Quranic text. And it's true, that's what a lot of these notes do, and I want to focus just for a moment on one of them, this note that is right over here. This thing right here is what's called a ligature. It's meant to draw your eye, and it means nota, notice. If you look at that closely, you'll see there's an N and an O and a T and an A all in it. Notice. You're supposed to pay attention to this. And if we look at it a little bit closer, here's that image blown up a little bit. What it says is, oh, by the way, this is on a specific verse of the Quran. It's right next to the first place in the Quran where the Islamic paradise is described. And the Islamic paradise, as you may know, is characterized in the Quran in very concrete physical images, especially the images of rivers of honey and milk, and the fact that there will be beautiful women there. There will be what is often translated pure maidens in paradise for the men who were there. And right next to this passage of the Quran, in many of the copies that circulated in medieval Europe, we have the first note. This is like the first thing they notice is the sexy paradise that Islam seems to offer. And the note over here says, note that everywhere Muhammad promises just such a paradise as this, a paradise of carnal delights, as another heresy did way in the past. That's a typical kind of note here. It draws attention to the fact that Islam could be seen as being much more sensual and sexual than Christianity, and it says Islam is also like an ancient Christian heresy at the same time. So these notes are the equivalent, they're the verbal equivalent of foaming at the mouth and steaming at the ears. Now, I don't want to suggest that all of these notes are like this. In fact, I spent a long time trying to demonstrate that there's a lot of other things going on in these notes besides this kind of invective and hostility. But it's true that on the surface, most of what we see in these notes is a kind of hostility to the Quran, and that was a mode of reading the Quran for Christians through the whole Middle Ages, and indeed all the way down to the present. But it is only one mode of reading the Quran. And then the other three case studies I want to provide for you, we're going to see quite different ways of interacting with the Quranic text. The second case study, oh, by the way, These notes at one point get so exasperated toward the end that in the middle of the margin at the side, it says in Latin, nota stultitiam ubique. Notice the stupidity everywhere. They just kind of throw up their hands. This text is just full of dangerous ideas, and I just don't know what to say anymore. But remember, it's only one way of reading the text. The second case study I want to do focuses on a particular individual, a man named Ricoldo da Monte di Croce. As his name would suggest, he is an Italian, was an Italian. And he was a member of the most learned religious order of the Middle Ages, of the High Middle Ages, that is the Dominican friars, a member of the order of preachers, as they were called, who, as an order, began in the early 13th century, and who took as their special job as a group of priests to preach the gospel both to Catholics anywhere they might be, but also to unbelievers. They had sort of the job description of being the people who were supposed to preach to people like Muslims and Jews. And they actually took some steps to get the education to make that possible. This order actually established special schools for members of their order to learn Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic, the languages of Muslims and Jews, so that they could read their holy texts and they could preach to Muslims and Jews. And Ricoldo was one of these people who seems to have studied in one of the Dominicans' language schools. And not only that, he traveled. He went to the Middle East, spent perhaps as long as 10 years traveling in what was left of the Crusader states by this point, and traveling through through what is now Israel and Syria, into Iraq, all the way into eastern Persia. He traveled north up into Kurdistan, and he was actually in Baghdad at the time when the last Crusader state surrendered to Muslim conquerors, and the Latin Christian project of trying to maintain states in the east end of the Mediterranean collapsed entirely. So he knew an enormous amount about Islam. He knew Arabs and Muslims and Persians personally. He says that he had spent time discussing religious issues with learned Muslim scholars in Baghdad. And at some point, about 1300, about 20 years before he died, he came back to Italy, to Florence, where he had grown up. And he sat down and he wrote several works, the most important of which, or at least the one I want to talk most about here, is a text called Against the Religion of the Muslims, Contra Legem Saracenorum, a polemical treatise, a treatise that attempted to demonstrate the falsity of Islam and the truth of Christianity. This is a treatise that would go on to exercise enormous influence after him. It exists itself in a very large number of manuscripts and was read and translated into other languages until about maybe 1700. If you wanted to find easily something to tell you about Islam, you probably picked up this treatise that he wrote. Well, we happen to know, for very interesting reasons, an enormous amount about how Ricoldo interacted with the Quranic text. Not only because he quotes it so often in this text that he wrote, but because, and these things happen, his own manuscript of the Quran in Arabic survived to the present with his marginalia in the margins. He had his own copy of the Quran in Arabic and wrote a lot of Latin notes there. You can see there are actually two hands here, a bigger, sloppier hand on top, and then around it a smaller hand. And this small hand, which you can kind of see is much more precise than the other hand. It's actually amazingly precise for marginal notes. Most people who write marginal notes in manuscripts in the Middle Ages do it just like we do, big sloppy handwriting, all that kind of stuff. This smaller hand is kind of obsessively careful, and that's the hand of our friend Ricoldo. And if we look at his encounter with the Quran, we find some surprising things. We find, first of all, that in many ways he's just like that earlier reader I talked about. He foams at the mouth a little bit, steams at the ears, says some pretty nasty stuff. But at the same time, this Dominican, and Dominicans always had the best education of any group in the Middle Ages, this Dominican who'd been so superbly educated is actually quite obsessive about getting the meaning of the Quran just right. He's sort of deeply preoccupied with it. And we can track this process if we watch him read his own copy of the Quran in Arabic and then write about what he's read in his treatise. And so let's see where we are. So to give you some sense of what these notes are like, his Latin notes, they tend to be translations of the Arabic that's immediately adjoining. The great majority are simply Latin translations, generally very careful of what's right next to it in Arabic. And so here we are in a section of the 9th surah of the Quran, and he has translated the 30th verse up here, saying that the Jews say that someone called Azir is the Son of God. The Christians say that Christ is the Son of God. And actually right here we have the words that he translated right over here, Uzair ibn Allah, Azir, Son of God, is the Son of God. So he's translating precisely what he sees there. But we see surprising things. Later on, he came back and he, whoops. And he said, well, that word, that name, Azir, that I have here, that's kind of weird. I wonder what that is. And he wrote above it a word that's a name much more familiar to us, Eleazar, because somehow he knew, and this is correct, that the person who is usually identified, who is called Uzair ibn Allah in the Quran, is usually thought to have been Eleazar from the Old Testament. Somehow he knows that, and that's a sign that this is a remarkably learned reader. And the place where we see this learning come out most strikingly is his care with how to translate the Arabic text. And I want to give you an example of this that demonstrates some of this obsessive quality that he has. One of the things that he did when he was reading the Quran is that he had his copy of the Arabic version open in front of him, and he had a Latin translation open in front of him as well, a Latin translation that had been done 80 years before or so. And it was a Latin translation that was very literal. The Latin translated the Arabic in the word order of the Arabic, which makes for very strange Latin, but that was not an uncommon thing to do at the time. And so it was very good if you wanted to have a kind of crib for the Arabic. This allowed you to have the equivalent of the Loeb Classic version, you know, the red and green Latin and Greek texts that they sell even in like Borders, where you have the English and the Latin or Greek on side by side on the page. This allows him to have the Loeb version of it. And that way he could sort of use the Latin to help him along a little bit. He could check what this earlier translator had done and so forth. And a lot of times when he wrote the translation of verses right next to the Arabic, he simply wrote down this guy's translation, this man named Mark of Toledo. But it became clear to him very quickly that Mark wasn't always right in his translations. And so he came to a case in the 3rd surah. It's a longish verse, and this is just the very end of it. It's a long verse in the Quran that talks about the children of Israel back in the time of Israel. And it says that in the time of Israel, the children of Israel were only required to not eat the foods that had already been pronounced by the family of Israel. This is about the kosher laws of the Jews. And so there's a long verse that says that. And remember that in the Quran, the voice that's speaking is normally God. God speaks through the angel Gabriel speaking through Muhammad. And so at the end of this verse, God says, and if you don't believe it, produce the Torah. Get out the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and read it. Get it out and read it. It's a rhetorical thing that you find other places in the Quran as well. So Mark of Toledo had translated the whole text, and when he got to this verse, he translated it this way. And I'm going to throw a little Latin at you here, but don't panic, and you can ask Damien, later on, or one of his colleagues if you have questions about it. But he translated it this way, and I will translate it into English in a moment. Aferte legem decalogi et sequimini eum si vos estis veraces. Produce, and then he has the law of the Decalogue. The law of the Decalogue, and follow it if you are truthful. Now, Ricoldo immediately recognized that there's a big problem here. The word in Arabic for Torah, it's exactly the same word, Taura, simply does not mean the Decalogue. The Decalogue refers to what? The Ten Commandments. And it's very strange. It's completely wrong to translate this passage as saying the Ten Commandments does that. And Ricoldo's writing it in his margin. He says, wait a second, that's not right. That's not right. And he corrects it as he writes it down. Here's his hand. Dic aferte Pentateuchum. Produce the Pentateuch and follow it if you are truthful. Well, then a little bit later, Ricoldo said, I want to use that passage in my treatise against Islam. And the reason he wanted to do this is that this is a passage of the Quran that seems to imply that the Bible is authoritative, because God himself says, look it up in the Bible. That must mean the Bible is authoritative, doesn't it? And so he wanted to quote it. And so he went back to his copy of the Quran in Arabic, and he saw his note up there, and he's going to write it into his treatise. But when he was going to do that, he recognized there's another problem with the way Mark had translated this. And that is the next word I've highlighted here, sequimini, which means follow. And it translates a verb, atlu in Arabic, that could mean follow, but that also means to read. And in this passage is always understood to mean to read. And so when he writes down the verse in his treatise, he corrects that as well. Can you see that over the top of this? Produce the Pentateuch, si estis veraces et legite. Produce it and read it. So here's a guy, and we find many examples of this, who keeps going back over and over and over to make sure that he's translated the text properly. And this goes even farther in that we have in Florence today the earliest manuscript of his treatise of this against the religion of the Muslims. And in it, next to a whole bunch of the Quranic citations, are numbers. And nobody had ever been able to figure out what those numbers are. And people had studied the manuscript very closely, couldn't figure out what this was. And I happened to be in Florence once looking at this manuscript, and I thought, wait, I bet I have an idea. What if those numbers refer back to the page numbers of his copy of the Quran in Arabic, and are his kind of footnotes to tell him, if you want to check it again, go to page so-and-so. And that's exactly what they are. So that even at the point when he was preparing the final fair copy of this work, he was still going back to the Quran to make sure he was getting it right. Now, what I want to suggest here is Ricoldo didn't have a lot of warm and fuzzy feelings about Islam. He was writing a treatise against it. He was in many ways a very hostile reader. But at the same time, he was kind of an impassioned, somewhat fanatical, scholarly reader of the Quran at the same time. And I think we need to understand about the Middle Ages in general, but certainly we need to understand about medieval religious people, that they could be that complicated. They were not simple-minded people. They were capable of very complex ways of interacting with text, just like we are. Let's do another case study. And it involves reading in a very different direction. Very different kind of reaction to the Quranic text. This is a manuscript of the Quran in Latin, and it's actually dated 1516, which isn't something we find all that often with manuscripts. So we know exactly when it was copied down. It's actually a copy of the translation of the Quran that I started with, that one from the middle of the 12th century. And this one, you'll notice, is visually very, very different. You have all of this color, this rather expensive illumination around the outside. This is a manuscript of the Quran produced in a particular style associated with Florence in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance period. And there are lots of interesting things about it as a kind of physical object. For one thing, the handwriting it's written in, if you looked at it long enough, you might say, well, that looks like italics. And that is right, because it is essentially italics. It's what is called humanist cursive handwriting, and it is from humanist cursive handwriting that our notion of italics comes from. It's a humanist hand associated with that movement of people in the Renaissance who were interested in studying ancient Greek and Latin texts. And one of the interesting things about this period is that these humanists used different alphabets for different kinds of texts. Generally speaking, anything that was a biblical text or a religious text, a theological text, stuff like that, they copied in what was becoming by this time the old-fashioned Gothic handwriting that to our eyes is much less clear, much less easy to read. They copied classical texts like, say, Cicero or Aristotle, things like that, in humanist handwriting. And so think about the fact that whoever put this manuscript together has presented the Quran visually like a classical Greek or Roman text. That's the visual reaction that we're supposed to get from this. Furthermore, there are very puzzling things, not puzzling, interesting things that happen as well. Can you see over the screen down here? At the bottom of the page, there's this picture of a guy wearing the turban, turned sideways. What has he got in his hand? What do you suppose? A book. He's got a book in his hand. This is what is called an author portrait. Something very common in this period, something that exists in a lot of other periods of book production, but is particularly common here. In your manuscript, say, of the Bible, you might have at the bottom of the first page an image of the apostle who wrote the gospel or whatever. You might have a picture of Dante in your copy of the Divine Comedy at the bottom. And so here we have Muhammad at the bottom of the text holding a book in his hand. And one of the things I think is striking about this, and here it's blown up a little bit, is that when you look closely at this image, you realize, well, this is a pretty amiable looking guy, you know. This is not a pejorative image of a Muslim. And by this period, most Europeans associated Islam with the Turks because it was the Ottoman Turks who really kind of embodied the threat of Islam. And Europeans knew how to paint nasty pictures of Turks, because there are a lot of them from this period. As, for example, these two. These are almost exactly contemporary. These are images of Sultan Mehmet II. And notice that we have all kinds of stereotypical things about these images. We have a large nose. They both seem to have that kind of 10,000-yard stare, like, if you take one more step, I'm going to kill you, sort of look. These are the sort of typical ways of depicting Turks in the early 16th century when you want to imagine Turks as a threat. And that image of Muhammad doesn't look like that. In fact, it looks a lot more, in some ways, like very different other kinds of images that we find from this period, like these two. This is a picture this is from 1483, so about 40 years earlier, of Plato and Aristotle. Plato over here, Aristotle here, Aristotle learning philosophy from his teacher Plato. And notice that Aristotle has a turban on. They both have big long beards. It was very typical in this period to depict the great Greek thinkers as kind of Turkish, kind of Middle Eastern, with the accoutrement of an Eastern sage, sort of. And we find lots and lots of these. And really, if you put Muhammad side by side with Aristotle there, you see neither one of these particularly has any of that kind of threatening thing associated with them that the images of Mehmed did. This is a pretty benign image of Muhammad. A benign image of Muhammad in a copy of the Quran that visually suggests that the Quran is not really a text to be attacked, as we saw in the previous two examples, but it's sort of one of those important texts, probably one that you maybe have a lot more than you ever read. You probably have some books like that, don't you, where you're kind of glad. I'm glad I have that copy of War and Peace on my shelf, but I've never got more than 35 pages into that thing. And I think the Quran may have fit in that niche, but it was still one that was desirable. And we know that because there are other versions of the Quran from this period that similarly are expensive copies of the Quran. We know that they were made for very wealthy collectors. And one of the striking things about them is that when you open up the pages of these copies of the Quran, they almost never have any notes in them, whether for or against. No one ever bothered to annotate them all over with their thoughts about it. It's because nobody ever read these things. They were sort of beautiful in-table books for the rich and famous of the day. And think about the fact that in 15th century, 16th century Europe, people thought that a perfectly good present to give to a wealthy person was a copy of the Quran. That's a very different attitude toward the Quranic text than the foaming at the mouth, steaming at the ears. This is kind of, well, the Quran is a very interesting, exotic text. My friends will be impressed. I have a copy of that. So that's a third way of reacting to the Quranic text, having it become a kind of consumer commodity, a way of conspicuously consuming. And one of these, I took the image out, and perhaps I shouldn't have. One of these beautiful copies of the Quran that we know of, and it's from about 1480, was given to the wealthiest man in Europe, the equivalent of Bill Gates of his age, a very wealthy Italian condottiere, a mercenary captain. And he had lots of books like this, lots of beautiful exotic books, and the Quran fit there. All right, well, let's move to a final case study. And in doing so, I'm going to move backward in time. That's not, you think historians are not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to move backwards, but I'm going to do it because, let's break the mold. I want to move backward in time, though, because I want to go back to a period and a place where we have still another very different way of reacting to the Quranic text. And where I'm moving back to now is about the 11th century, the 1000s. And I'm moving south in Europe to Spain. And as many of you will know, Spain in this period was largely under the control of Arab Muslim rulers. And they called what we think of as now as Spain, they called it Al-Andalus. And in that part of the Islamic world, just as in the Middle East, a lot of very large Christian communities lived on under Islamic rule. In fact, I think, if you only know one thing about Christian-Muslim relations from this lecture, I hope you remember this, that for most of the Middle Ages and well into the modern period, Christians were, in some cases, the majority of the population in much of the Arab Islamic world. And almost everywhere, there were at least some Christians. So Christians and Muslims were always in contact with each other throughout this whole period. And one of the places where this is so is in Spain. And a community of Christians who, over generations, this happened all over the place, became very Arab-like. They took on speaking Arabic. Arabic became their natural language, their home language, their language that they did business in, the language that they wrote. They took Arabic names. In many ways, they became just like the Muslims without converting to Islam. In doing so, however, they had to develop a very interesting relationship with the Quranic text. And we see a very interesting relationship emerge if we look closely at their religious books. And what you see before you here is a copy of the Psalms translated into Arabic from the medieval Latin version. The Psalms, of course, are the most important prayer book of the Christian church, and not surprisingly, they were the first part of the Bible to be translated into Arabic, so that these Arabic speakers had the hymns in the Psalms translated for them into the language that they then knew best. How am I doing on time? I don't know. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I want to do here, because it's just so darn cool. I want to do a little bit of a digression, because this manuscript has fascinating things about it. This manuscript, by the way, is in the Vatican. It is Vatican Arabic manuscript number 5. Notice that we have the Arabic written here, and this looks maybe a little bit different from the Arabic script you've seen, because this is what is called Maghribi script, the script of Arabic that was written in the Western Islamic lands, and especially in Spain in the Middle Ages. But right up above it here, you see words written in another language. Anybody know what that language is? That is Hebrew. That is essentially cursive Hebrew. And that's because this manuscript, which was copied in about the 14th century, at some point afterward got into the hands of a Jew living in North Africa. There were lots and lots of Jews in North Africa down into this century. And this Jewish gentleman sat down, and above every word in this Arabic version of the Quran, he wrote the Hebrew words, the corresponding Hebrew words. So that here we have a text that's been translated from Latin into Arabic, and then he's gone back and shown us what the original Hebrew of all of that was. Well, and that isn't the only interesting thing about this manuscript. If we, and here I've blown this up, that's the Hebrew. But then if we look close as well, we find on many pages Latin written in as well. And this is because this manuscript eventually, at the end of the Middle Ages, came into the hands of an Italian scholar who knew Latin, and he then sat down and said, well, I need to be able to identify which psalms these are quickly. And the way medieval people knew the psalms, they knew which one was which, is they knew the first few words of them. You didn't use numbers so much as you used the first few words. And so here, he's written down, and this would be hard to see, Domine probasti me, O Lord, you have tested me. Anybody know what psalm begins that way? The 139th psalm begins that way. That's the Latin version of the 139th psalm. And every single psalm in here, he's gone through and written the first few Latin words of it, so he knew which psalm was being talked about. I wanted to go through that digression because I wanted you to understand something else as well. Books traveled all the time among these communities. Books could travel all over the place in the Mediterranean. That Quran I started with, that Arabic Quran, was copied in Egypt or in Syria and wound up, as we saw, in Florence. Books could travel a lot between these communities, and holy books traveled a lot between them. They were reading each other's books quite a bit. These people, whom Muslims refer to as peoples of the book, found themselves reading each other's books surprisingly often. So that's my digression, and let me go back to what I was talking about here. There's the Domine probasti me. Okay, whoops, that went farther than I wanted. Oh, sorry. Okay. Now, that copy of the Psalms in Arabic is preceded in that manuscript by a long preface in Arabic by some Christian about the importance of the Psalms and why the Psalms are the most important book for Christians and that kind of thing. And what's interesting about that preface and indeed about the Psalms that follow it, are that over and over we find the writer, the Christian writer of this preface, using specifically Quranic language to write about Christian stuff. And this, in fact, was an enormously common reaction to the Quran among Christians who lived in the Islamic world. Almost without trying, they absorbed the language of the Quran by learning Arabic. Most of them, if they were learned, had studied the Quran, because the Quran is the literary model for all Arabic. So they knew the Quran very, very well. In fact, there are times when we find medieval Arab Christians saying they're quoting the Bible, but actually quoting the Quran, a passage of the Quran that's similar to the Bible. So the Quranic language was all around them, and they wind up absorbing it, and they wind up expressing their own Christian ideas using Quranic language. And I want to give you about 4 examples of this. The first one is a very significant central phrase in Arabic, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, which I'm sure most of you will have heard in some context or other. This is the phrase, it's often just called the basmalah, that is at the beginning of every surah of the Quran except one. It's at the beginning of almost any kind of document written in the Middle Ages in Arabic, and many modern ones as well. It's just how you start things. You say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And so at the beginning of this Christian treatise about the Psalms, we have a Bismillah at the beginning, just like a Muslim would. Now, there are alternatives to this. There was, it quickly developed among Christians, a kind of trinitized version of this. Bismil Ab wal Ibn wal Ruh Qudus, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that was known in Spain, but here they just use the same one that's in the Quran. That's what they do in their civilization. We also find specific words being used that are, for anybody who knows Arabic, distinctive and almost unique to the Quran. And what I have before you is an example. The disciples, Jesus is of course talked about a lot in the Quran, and his disciples are talked about a fair number of times. And when the Quran talks about Jesus' disciples, it uses a very, very unusual word to do so, the word hawariyun. This word was so unusual, in fact, that it wound up as a regular item in a special kind of dictionary that medieval Arabs developed for Quranic study. Dictionaries of what were called the guruba, the weird things, the unusual words in the Quran. And hawariyun is in there. The reason is that it doesn't make any sense in Arabic. Most Arabic words you can figure out the meaning of from knowing the 3 basic consonants that form its root. The 3 basic characters here, the 3 consonants HWR, are very uncommon in Arabic, and it's very difficult to say what it meant. And there are all kinds of elaborate theories about why they're called this. But interestingly enough, in Islamic Spain, where they could have done other things, you could, for example, because they do this with other things, they could have just transliterated the Latin words into Arabic. You could have just said discipulis and written it in Arabic letters, or apostolos, something like that. They don't. They just use the Quranic word, hawariyun. Jesus is surrounded by his hawariyun. In this text, and also there's a version of the 4 Gospels that in Arabic that circulated in this community. They're just called the hawariyun there as well. All right, one of the, another very strikingly Quranic phrases, and it appears over and over and over in the Quran, is that God is the one who khalaqa as-samawati wal ard wa ma bainahuma. God is the one who created the heavens and the earth and what is between them. What is between them? This is a saying that, for one thing, you couldn't really say nearly as easily in Latin, because Arabic, like most of the older Semitic languages, has a feature that we don't have in Western languages, and that is a dual. In Arabic, you can talk about a thing in the singular, you can talk about a thing in the plural, And you can talk about things specifically in twos, and there's a special ending that you use for something in two. And this has a pronoun that is a dual pronoun. Huma there means specifically between the two of those things. So it's very specifically Semitic as a construction. Now, while the rest of it, God created the heavens and the earth, that's in the Bible all the time. But not God created the heavens and the earth and what is between them. That is specifically Quranic. And then there's something else that the writer has done here. He has said that it is the Kalima who created the heavens and the earth and what is between them. Now, Kalima means word. It is the word, here spoken in the divine sense. Who was the word in Christian theology? Jesus is the Word. The second person of the Trinity is the Word. And so in this passage, the Christian writer says, we're talking here about Jesus, and by the way, it's Jesus who created the heavens and the earth and what is between them. So this is almost a kind of an aggressive use of Quranic language. It's sort of one-upping Muslims to say, well, we've heard about the guy who creates the heavens and the earth and what's between them, but we believe and we know it's Jesus, not just God. So there's something, this is a way of kind of getting at Muslims almost in doing so. One more example. The seventh verse of the Quran, Quran as a whole, comes at the very beginning, and you may know that the surahs of the Quran, the subdivisions of the Quran, are organized by and large by order of length, and they go from longest to shortest. So the first substantial surah of the Quran is also the longest one. But before that one, there's a little short one that is called the Fatiha, and often it's said that the Fatiha functions like the Christian Lord's Prayer. It's used over and over in daily prayers. It's used in all kinds of circumstances. It's very, very common. And one of the things that is striking that it says at the very end is it says, no, not at the very end. This is about the second verse. The second verse. I was thinking of something else. It says, praise be, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to the Lord, or to God, the Lord of the worlds. It's a very striking thing. It's not the Lord of the world, but of the worlds. And there's an enormous amount of discussion among Muslims in the Middle Ages about why do we have worlds there? What does that mean? The elaborate philosophical and other kinds of discussions of it. But it's also very distinctively Quranic. And one of the reasons that ending is there to make it plural, that "een" at the end is what makes that word plural, is that the Quran is not in verse, but it is in rhymed prose. So the endings of lines rhyme with each other. And in the Fatiha, the end rhyme is in "een" or "im." And so he actually needed something that went "een" at the end, and alam by itself doesn't do that. And in fact, the normal plural of this word is another interesting feature of Semitic languages, and especially Arabic, that usually, to make a plural of a word, you don't add something at the end. You sort of rearrange the middle and make it into a plural. And so the plural of this, alam, would be something like awalim. And that didn't work as far as he was concerned nearly as well as alamin, which gave a good stress at the end and all of that kind of stuff. So it's this particular plural, which is unusual for this word. I've never seen this word pluralized this way anywhere else except at the end of this line, is very specific to the Quran. And here's a Christian author who takes this phrase and he uses it at the ends of subsections of his preface. Just like a Muslim would, he says, praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Now that's a very different reaction to the Quranic text than the other three we saw here. What we see here is a kind of embrace, in some ways, of Quranic language as being perfectly useful as Christian language, with the occasional sort of aggressive adoption that sort of shows that Christianity can go one better than Islam with Quranic language itself. So I hope what you've gathered from my lecture tonight is that we shouldn't think of pre-modern people ever as somehow simple-minded or unsophisticated like us. And I say that because a lot of us were raised essentially to think that, because we were raised on the myth of progress, that people get smarter and smarter and smarter as the ages go by, and that's why we're so great, and they were just not very smart back then. But that's not true in general. But we specifically have to remember that about religious thinkers in the Middle Ages, because the one place where that idea that medieval people were kind of ignorant compared to us, the one place where that still flourishes is our gut reactions to medieval religious thinkers, whom we do, unless we check it, kind of natively think, well, I mean, they weren't capable of anything but blacks and whites. They weren't capable of shades of gray. And I hope you've taken from this that even when it came to the scripture of Latin Christianity's greatest rival, people were perfectly capable of seeing shades of gray and using them to their own advantage. So thank you, and I'd welcome any questions or comments or Bronx cheers, whatever, Yes, ma'am. Yeah. They're really kind of fun because in cases like this, the Quran actually has, most scholars would agree, a fair number of words that really are foreign words. They aren't Arabic words. And they were absorbed from peoples around them. But there was a whole tendency in Islamic thought to say, no, the Quran the Quran says at one place that it was delivered in pure Arabic. So there was a whole trend that said, oh, every one of these words, if we just think hard enough, really is an Arabic word. And so for this one, to try to dream up an Arabic etymology for it, they said, well, there is a root HWR in Arabic, and it means something like to clean or to bleach something. And so they said, well, the Hawariyun are called that because they were what would be called fullers, that is, people who bleached wool that was going to be used in, like in hats and stuff like that. Or they were called what might be, we might translate this as whiteners, because they wore white garments. And very often in Quranic commentaries you'll see that they're called that because they were holy men who wore white garments. What modern scholars say is that this word almost certainly came from Ethiopic and was an Ethiopic Christian word that made sense in Ethiopic to use for the disciples. And that kind of conundrum shows up a fair number of times in Arabic. Yes? Well, there are many things. If you wanted to read something, one of the really interesting dimensions of this interchange is a scientific one. And there are many really interesting things that have been written about how Greek science and philosophy and medicine was translated mostly by Christians into Arabic for Muslim rulers and wealthy people. And you would want to look at a book by a man named Dimitri Gutas, G-U-T-A-S, called Greek into Arabic, something like that. So it's a very, I think, quite an accessible study of why they translated all this work, what were the consequences of it, that kind of thing. There are similar works about, because then what happened is all that Arabic science and philosophy was translated into Latin at a later period. I could give you more on that. If you wanted, you could read my book about reading the Quran in Latin Christendom. I mean, I'm not saying go out and buy it right now, but it's a book called Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom. It's really an area of a great deal of scholarship right now. There's a terrific book a colleague, a friend of mine, wrote recently about what does Islam look like and Muslims look like in medieval vernacular literature, especially in France and England, called Idylls in the East. Another very accessible work. I don't know if any of those helps, but there's a long list. Yes, sir. This is part of that short surah that is used in daily devotions, but not necessarily with prayer beads. Most often it wouldn't be, but in some circles of Islam you might find prayer beads being used. This would normally be used when you're praying in the mosque or praying by yourself 5 times a day, when prayer beads usually aren't used. Yeah, well, there's two answers to that. Yes, these translations were known in Northern Europe. In fact, the one that was most widely read, which was that first one, circulated almost entirely in Northern Europe. There's a very strange irony here. The first 2 translations of the Quran were made in Spain, and neither one of them circulated in Spain. It's like they both were translated and immediately taken elsewhere. And so the great majority of that version that exists in 25 manuscripts, probably 18 of them at least are Northern European manuscripts. So it was known very well in England, France, Germany, all of those territories. But the other part of your question, would they have exchanged these beautiful Qurans as gifts in Northern Europe? And I don't think so. There certainly was a kind of a broader range of possible reactions to Islam in the Mediterranean, I think, than in Northern Europe. People in Italy and Spain came across Muslims frequently. If they lived in a port city, Muslim merchants were there a great deal of time. All kinds of Islamic artistic motifs became common. One of the most common ones, and you've probably seen this but didn't know what you were looking at, in Italy especially, we find used over and over as an artistic motif what art historians called pseudo-Kufic, which really means fake Arabic, script that is kind of Arabic-like or maybe a little bit like Hebrew. Sometimes it really is Arabic, but most of the time it's kind of fake stuff. And you find that all over in Italy. You find it in the nimbus of images of the Virgin Mary, for example. And I always liken that to the fact that if you travel much in the rest of the world, you will notice that you'll see people wearing t-shirts or sweatshirts that have English words on them that don't mean anything, right? The favorite one I've seen recently is about 2.5 years ago. I was in Rome, and I was with my family, and we had just gone into the Vatican museums, and I came out a little bit early, and I was waiting outside where a bunch of workmen were putting in some new marble right beside the Vatican museums. And they're working away, and there's this one really burly guy, and he's got a sweatshirt on, and it says, Alaska, Ohio. Now, any American, that's nonsense. You'd never put that on a shirt. But it's because English has this cachet about it. English is the language of power and wealthy people and science and all that kind of stuff. Well, in the Middle Ages, Arabic was that language. Arabic was the language that you wrote nonsense in, just so you could show that you have sophisticated tastes. So in Italy, that kind of thing is much more possible. And at least the cases that I know of, where we have manuscripts like that, they're all Italian ones. Yes, sir. You- uh, to, yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. It's often said, and this is largely true, that Spain in the 13th century was the most tolerant place in Europe, and by the end of the 16th century is the least tolerant place. Spain in the 13th century had a mixed population of Muslims and Christians and Jews. By 1600, at least nominally, there were no Muslims left, no Jews left. It had become a Catholic land. And this is actually an enormous question and a very difficult one to answer, but maybe I can suggest a few things. It has to do in part with the building of states. The late Middle Ages is a period when we see monarchs attempting to create more and more powerful apparatus through which they can rule. And fairly often we find them trying to eliminate religious diversity from their realms because they have a sense that a unified realm religiously can be governed more effectively. And so this is why we see, for example, the French originally grant Huguenots the right to live in France, that is French Protestants, in certain cities, but then under Louis XIV, that's revoked. No longer are we going to allow Protestants. France has to be a Catholic country. So that's one part of the thing. The other part of it is truly Spain went through a series of unique difficulties religiously that made it in some ways become more extreme this way than other lands. And specifically the thing that made this whole issue so complex for Christians in Spain was that in the late 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, there were a series of violent outbursts in Spain against Jews that led to very large numbers of Jews being forcibly converted to Christianity. Some of them converted freely, but most of them were forcibly converted to Christianity. Now, the church actually said very clearly, you can't force somebody to convert. That is a sinful thing to do. But it also said, rather conveniently, that, well, once they're converted, they're still converted anyway. And so Spain had a very large population of converted Jews, and some of them acted like Catholics, some of them didn't. Some pretty clearly were creating a kind of syncretistic version of both. And this became, in Spain, a very big social problem. It was a very messy problem trying to figure out who belongs where. And one of the attempts to solve this was to create the Inquisition. That's what the Inquisition was invented, the Spanish Inquisition was invented for, to find these Jews who are supposed to be Catholics but are acting Jewish and try to make them act Catholic, which did not work, in fact. And so Ferdinand and Isabella, who themselves were quite philo-Semitic in most ways, at the urging of their ministers decided, look, the only thing we can do to end this century of uncertainty and awful social problems is to expel all the Jews, which they did in 1492. Expel all the Jews, and then soon afterwards forcibly convert the remaining Muslims. Those are two things that interacted in this direction. They're not the only two that make it happen. It, in many ways, is a big part of the transition from a medieval world, which was actually a lot more comfortable with pluralism in general than the early modern world was. One of those other ironies of history. So I don't know. That's as far as I could go in the time I have. But those are some of the things. Good question. Yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the reasons why I said the medieval world is in some ways more welcoming of pluralism is that the medieval world handled some things fundamentally differently, and one of them is law. There's a long tradition in the Middle Ages of, rather than having territorial law, that is a single law code that covers a whole country or a whole state, for example, you had what is called personal law. Law that covered X group of people, and a different law covered Y group of people. That was sort of normal stuff for medieval world. And all over the Mediterranean, what happened if one country dominated by one religion had a lot of believers in another religion was that they simply said, okay, you people can live here, you follow your own laws, except when they conflict with ours, you govern yourself, you'll be a kind of a autonomous community within our country, you're subject to us, and don't forget it, and we might slap you around a little bit to remind you, but we're going to let you go about your business. And so in medieval Spain, Christians were governed by Christian law, Jews were governed by the Talmud, as it was elaborated by the rabbis, and Muslims were governed by the Sunnah, by the Sharia law. That was a steady state for a long period of time. And so Muslims were governed by an Arabic law code, Jews by a Hebrew one, Christians by a Latin/Castilian one. And then they each used those languages within their communities as well. And by the way, they also marked their language use in a really interesting way. Did you ever think about why it is what alphabet do we use to write English? It's not the English alphabet, it's the Latin alphabet. Why do we use the Latin alphabet? Seems kind of weird, doesn't it, when you stop and think about it? We use the Latin alphabet because England used to be part of the Catholic Church. And by and large, the languages today which write with the Latin alphabet were Catholic countries, because Latin was the language of the Catholic Church. And no matter what language they wrote, whether it was Latin or their vernacular, they wrote it in the Latin language. Greek Christian communities use Greek. Jews use the Hebrew alphabet all over the Mediterranean to write whatever language, so you could write Castilian in Hebrew letters. And Muslims use the Arabic alphabet to write Spanish in. So there's a whole body of literature from medieval Spain written in Spanish in Arabic characters. And I say that because these groups not only use different languages and different laws, they marked kind of visually that they were doing that. And I actually think that's part of what makes this thing sustain itself so long. There's a kind of not only an official legal quality to this division, there's actually a visual one. We know what world we're stepping into by looking at the alphabet that is being written. All right, I probably bored you enough.
Please join me in thanking.
Thank you all.